just a little bit about myself before we get going. As said, my name is Chad. I'm originally from Chandler, Arizona. I grew up on kind of a small farm, um, a lot of different kind of backyards type animals, a lot of poultry of every different kind. I think we even had an emu at one time, a lot of peacocks, guinea fowl, chickens, pheasants, quail, you name it. But we also had a lot of sheep and goats. And growing up, that didn't mean much to me. But as I got older and then I was trying to figure out how to make a living. I originally thought I wanted to be a veterinarian, and as time went on, I became more interested in things like ruminant nutrition. And then ultimately in grad school, I started working with um, sheep producers in Montana. And just after a short amount of time, I realized these are the type of people I want to work with. And luckily enough, I now have a position where I can discuss sheep and goats and work with people who raise them. And so today I just kind of wanted to go over a timely production issue, which is essentially things we should consider as we're going into lambing and kidding. Some of us who maybe have show lambs or show goats maybe have already started this process or have already ended. But I just wanted to go further into maybe some of our hobby farms that are still getting ready to go into this, or take notes on what we could do different and to be more successful the next year if we were to run into any hiccups. Now, I'm a pretty active presenter in person. It sometimes is difficult for me to do webinars. So if I could just get anyone that is currently on, if you want to just type in the chat box um, where you're from, if you have sheep or goats, and then just say sheep or goats, and then maybe one thing you would like to know about the lambing process or something maybe you've struggled with. And as you do that, I'm going to kind of continue on. But one thing that we really need to think about, and I put this picture of some of the polypay sheep that we have at the university here. This picture, you can see that we're now into our group pens. And in these group pens, we have all of our ewes, and each ewe in this pen specifically actually has twins on her. We have pretty prolific sheep here. And right now, I think this year we had a 220% lamb crop. And right now, with the storms coming in, we have, I think we're on par, Andrea, to go into a roughly a 260% lamb crop. So very prolific sheep. Almost all the sheep have twins, triplets, and then quads are not uncommon. So it looks like we have a lot of people that are mentioning they have goats. We have Jody from Rapid City, South Dakota. Nice to hear from you. Thanks for joining us. Wyoming, Virginia, Dorpers, hair sheep are becoming more and more popular. Okay, so as we're thinking about raising our smaller ruminants, there's a lot of questions to ask. And first and foremost is what of the goals are of our operation? I would argue that generically, they are to have healthy lambs, especially this time of year, have good animal welfare. In our case at the university, higher lambing percentage generally makes more money, right? So two 60-pound lambs at the sale barn generally make more money than one 80-pound lamb. Now, there are some situations where maybe you have a younger ewe, maybe she's a ewe lamb that's lambing for the first time. Maybe you want her to have a single, or maybe you're selling some show sheep and it's easier to market large showy singles than it is our twins sometimes. And so there can be advantages to having maybe singles instead of twins or triplets. But for I think the most of us, having more generally is more advantageous to our pocketbooks. Increased lamb weights, and that comes with animal welfare and good nutrition, superior genetics, and economically sustainable. If we think of the three pillars that actually keep sustainability on our operation, it's environmental, economical, and social. And so not only do our animals need to be accepted or our protein accepted or our fibers accepted, however we're raising our sheep or goats, we need to have some economic sustainability. I understand a lot of our smaller farm flocks now, maybe it's not our first source of income, and so maybe it doesn't matter as much if we make money on it, but even then we would like to at least break even with some of our hobbies, right? It looks like we have some more people coming in talking about Icelandics and some other cool backyard breeds and heritage breeds. Okay, so ultimately, this is what we want. We want potentially two offspring with a healthy doe, in this case, with two kids. Um, Healthy animals, good welfare, um, kidding and lambing at correct times, and everything is looking great. So, how do we start that off? First and foremost, I'm really going to hit this home. This becomes so important, and there is so much research that talks about the importance of vaccinations uh, for the health of your kids. And so, before we get to actually having the kids and lambs, first thing we need to look at is vaccinations. So, ruminants, sheep, goats, cattle, all sorts of things or ruminant animals are born without an active immune system. It really doesn't develop, and they can't really make their own antibodies until 2 to 3 weeks after they're born. And so the passive transfer of colostrum is really vital to our lamb and kids survivability. Okay. I really want to stress that. Now, in order to make sure that they have a good cocktail of antibodies and vitamins and minerals, we need to make sure that we're treating our ewes and does appropriately prior to lambing. Okay. So, rule of thumb is generally 4 weeks out from lambing or kidding. We want to vaccinate our ewes and our does with a bare minimum of a CD&T. Now, this vaccine you can buy at Cal Ranch or Tractor Supply or whatever your kind of ag store is near you. And it stands for Clostridium perfringens type C and D. This is essentially overeating disease in lambs, if you know that. And then the T stands for tetanus. Okay. Giving it 4 weeks out from lambing and kidding allows that antibody to grow enough in the ewe so that when that lamb or kid goat goes to take the colostrum, those antibodies are kind of peaked in the amount that they are. So it gives them the greatest amount of passive immunity. If we do it too close to lambing or kidding, they may not have enough or sufficient antibodies. Okay. And so good health in the lambing and kidding barn generally starts with good management around your ewes and your does. Some other things to think about that are important getting ready for lambing and kidding. If we have sheep, like some of us mentioned, we have Icelandics or some other breeds of wool type sheep. Ideally, we want to shear those sheep in that last third of gestation. And so 40 to 70 days prior to lambing, 2 months is kind of the standard. If you're unable to shear, maybe crutching is recommended. So, like this picture in the top corner, this is probably a Suffolk or Hamp type ewe that has the wool crutched around the vulva um, and around the udder. And so this allows some of that afterbirth to clean up a little bit easier. It also keeps bacteria away from the teats and the udder a little bit more. And so everything is just a little bit cleaner in your lambing jugs or your barn or maybe your pasture. Okay. Um, so that's recommended. Another thing I want to kind of point out with shearing sheep prior is the best way to remove external parasites off sheep. So if you're dealing with something like sheep keds or lice, shearing your sheep will remove about 75% of that problem. And so if you're able to get that wool off prior to lambing and treat those ewes that had the issue, you're much less likely to then spread those parasites to your sheep. Okay. Some of the benefits is cleaner environment, reduced mastitis, spread of external parasites, improved fleece quality. And those of us who are maybe really focused on wool, and so Icelandic producers, Romney, maybe hand spinners, those of you, if you shear prior to lambing like this, most of the breaks in our wool generally occur around the stress of lambing. So if you're selling to a hand spinner and you actually don't shear towards the summer, but you had in the springtime, you had a lot of stress from lambing or maybe mastitis, you may have a wool break right in the middle of your staple length on your fleece, which makes it harder to market that fleece. But if you shear around lambing, then it allows you to market that. And if it does have a break, it's generally towards the end of part of that wool fiber. So you don't really have a lot of loss in yield and you still keep a lot of staple length. Okay. And then lastly, um, ewes fit better in the feed bunk. There's not so much wool, and lambs have an easier time getting to the teat. With this, I'll also mention that I really recommend people choose for those does and those ewes that don't have multiple extra teats. That can become confusing. And so if you have a lot of long wool and potentially extra teats that are semi or non-functional, those lambs could latch on to a lock of dirty wool, or they could latch on to an extra teat that's non-functional, and then they could spend a lot of energy trying to get um, they could spend a lot of energy trying to get milk out, and they ultimately can become frustrated and then go off that ewe, and we really don't want that. And so if there's a way that we can make sure wool is off, that we're selecting for good mammary structure, good teats on our ewes, that's best. Okay. Another really big thing that we'll see prior to lambing, and we're about to get to the whole lambing part of this, but another huge thing, and probably one of the biggest calls of that veterinarians get associated with small ruminants, especially sheep that are really prolific, is something that we call twin lamb disease, or ovine ketosis. It's a state of ketosis where they're metabolizing their own energy stores and maybe even breaking down muscle at a faster rate than they can build it back up. We also will call this pregnancy toxemia. You may hear people call it. And the cause essentially is an adequate energy intake during late gestation. Generally, it's the ewes carrying twins, triplets. Sometimes with really big singles, this can happen, but usually it's when they have a lot of fetuses. And part of the issue here is that these ewes, and this is just the miracle of sheep and goats, I think, in late pregnancy, their blood glucose is prioritized to the lambs and kids. And so only after those lambs and kids are taken care of in late pregnancy, when the majority of growth is happening, up to 75% of that fetal growth happens in late pregnancy. As they're growing, that ewe is the last one to get blood glucose concentrations. So if you're not feeding her a high enough energy content, she'll start going into a state of ketosis, which ultimately can become fatal. As we try to treat these ewes, especially if they go off feed, it can become very difficult. One of the ways to treat them is with glycol oral drench. And even then, it becomes very difficult. But this problem is compounded more because these fetuses start getting so big that they push up against the rumen or the stomach or that giant fermentation vat that they rely on for energy. And so as those fetuses grow, usually they're most prone to this in the last 4 weeks prior to lambing and kidding. And so that is usually the time frame when we want to, around the same time we vaccinate, we want to make sure that we're giving them a diet that's high enough in energy that they can accommodate the lambs that they're trying to raise in utero. Okay. This is a very common problem. And even unfortunately, us at the university, we have lost at least one ewe this year due to this. Even with a clinical veterinarian on call, it just becomes very difficult to deal with once those ewes get a little too far. Okay, so now we've done the vaccinations. We've taken care of the ewe on the front end. We're giving her adequate nutrition. We've shorn her. We've done all these different things. Okay. Now we're looking at our does and we're looking at our ewes and we're looking for signs of parturition. Sheep and goats have a lot of things in common. One, they're really attentive. Okay. They pay attention to things because they're a prey animal. Okay. Two, they are very gregarious, which is essentially a fancy term to say they are very flock oriented. They like to be together. And also, the third thing is they like to eat. So, if they're not coming to the feed bunk or they're separating themselves away from their flock, or maybe they just don't notice you and they don't get up when you walk into the barn, these are all signs that generally throughout the year would tell us there may be something wrong with this doe or with this ewe. But around parturition, if we're expecting lambs to come, these could actually be normal signs that we're getting ready for parturition or the act of birth. Okay. Some other things to look for in combination with this are an engorged udder. So sometimes we'll in the industry we'll call this bagging up. Usually this is a really good indicator that your animals are pregnant. So if you never did ultrasound or you never did a blood test or anything to check for pregnancy, if you waited towards the end of gestation or the end of pregnancy, the fact that a ewe or a doe is bagging up is a really good indicator that yes, there's lambs that are going to be coming. This generally happens weeks before with does or ewes that have actually lambed and kid before. But if this is their first time having a baby, this may only happen to some of those first time mothers like a day before. And so may not be a lot of great indicators that she's about to have a baby unless you have done an ultrasound with your veterinarian or you've done blood draws to prove it. Okay. Some other things right before is we'll see a swollen vulva. So this vulva will start to swell, maybe have some discharge from this vulva. The ewe or doe will start acting a little bit different. Like we talked about, those three characteristics, they may separate themselves off and start nesting behavior, pawing at the ground, breathing heavier. And sometimes, like to point out here, the tail head, even though this is a really tight docked tail on this picture here, this tail head becomes kind of a little bit more erect. And this is usually a sign that they're starting to strain, getting ready for pushing, which would be the first stage of parturition or that first stage of expulsion. Okay. The ewe or doe may also go off feed for a little bit. Now, if they're still pretty far out from your calculated lambing date, this may be a sign of pregnancy toxemia. So we want to make sure that we watch for that, right? After a ewe or doe expels the water bag, so that initial first water bag, the first lamb or kid should come around 30 minutes. And I usually say 30 to 40 minutes after. If it's much longer than 45 minutes, you should start looking to see if you need to intervene. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail on that right now, but I just wanted to put it out there. Okay. But 30 to 40 minutes is usually a pretty common time that it may take that ewe after that water bag comes out before she actually expels a lamb or a kid in the case of goats. Now, how should that lamb be coming out? Well, Superman style. We're raising superheroes. And so in this case, this is a kind of a picture perfect scenario where this lamb, and it's a single, hopefully we have twins in there, right? But this single is coming out with front legs out first, upright, followed by the head. Okay. So as we're seeing the kind of swollen vulva, the discharge, and then the water bag, soon after that, we should start seeing these hooves. And you'll recognize based on the way that the hooves bend, that those hooves are coming out the right way. And then also, if you're seeing the top side of the hoof instead of the back side of the hoof. Now, some ways that ultimately they could come out bad in the case of sheep or goats are many. Okay. In the cattle world, they often have issues with maybe a lamb being too big genetically, and they actually have to select for sires or bulls that will have calves that are slightly smaller, and they call these calving ease bulls, right? My discussions with a lot of sheep and goat geneticists is that we're not quite to that stage in our industry where we have to select genetically for smaller animals. Usually, our complications are based around a lot of other things. And in the case of having multiple offspring, a lot of times it may be that two offspring are trying to come out at the same time, or all these other varying ways that the lamb or kid could be presenting. So we have upside down. We have maybe one hoof coming and one leg tucked back. Kind of a tricky one sometimes is this one where the head is turned back and the front legs are coming out normal. If those front legs are coming out, they should be soon followed by the nose of the animal. If it's not and it's starting to get to the legs, you may want to see if you can intervene and flip that head so that the nose comes out with it. Okay. Sometimes you'll have three front hooves coming off or out at the same time, and that may be a good chance to go ahead and figure out which one is a different animal and then push that lamb or kid back in so that just one can come out um, at a time. Okay. Um, and I don't mean to scare anyone with any of this talk, but these are common issues that we deal with in our industry, especially us backyard flocks. And maybe some of us have a hard time finding veterinarians to help us. So the more education we have on this, the better. Some other ways that we deal with dystocia or having a hard time lambing or kidding may be a failure to dilate. Okay, that's not quite as common, but it can happen. An extra large lamb or kid, I would say that I've seen that more with our show lambs where we're selecting for really fast growing genetics, and with that comes large kids and lambs. Okay. Multiples coming simultaneously. We talked about that. The presentation, bad presentation. Or this is a really common one. And we deal with this at the university because we're teaching people how to help with lambs and kids. Sometimes disturbing that ewe or doe too much in the early phases. So you see that lamb or kid starting to come. Well, and then you go out and watch, but then you want to bring out your kid or maybe your grandkid, or pretty soon it's a party and you're all trying to watch this ewe or doe. Well, that may be that may disturb them, and it actually may kind of stop that process from progressing normally. And so we want to give them a little bit of their own time while they're going through that process. Okay. And I'll talk about maybe some other alternatives we have to watching that without being so close by. Okay. Our animals that we should probably watch first and foremost are first time mothers, potentially obese animals. This happens a lot with our backyard producers where we like to feed our animals a lot of different treats, and maybe our animals are over conditioned. Obese animals sometimes will have issues during around lambing and also with ketosis. And then lack of exercise during late pregnancy. So they're just confined in a pen a lot. They don't have a lot of opportunity to go and walk and things like that. And these are actually things that we see even in the human world, right? So now, what's one of those ways that maybe we don't have to intervene as much? Well, cameras in the lambing barn is a really good one. I do a monthly webinar with the University of Idaho and South Dakota. So shout out to South Dakota. I saw one of our producers from Rapid City on there. Um, but we did I think it's been 4 or 5 years now. We had a producer from Utah get on and talk to us about using cameras in the lambing barn and how powerful this can be with small farm flocks, or maybe you have another job that takes a lot of your time. This can make lambing kidding checks really easy. And instead of getting up and putting on your muck boots and tromping out to the farm, out to the barn, which I think has a lot of value, you could roll over and look at your camera and see that, okay, those user does I'm watching are doing well, and I don't have to get out of bed and go out into the cold. Okay. So you can get more sleep. You can have a happier marriage, I think. A good lambing season also helps with marriages, I think. And you're not disturbing the mother, and you're letting her naturally lamb and kid. Okay. Some other things, once we finally get those lambs out successfully, um, our ewes and does will lamb or kid generally around a 7 day window, either before or after we calculate it. So if I have everyone starting to come around February 14th on Valentine's Day, like clockwork, we started having a couple trickle in a week before. And then these storm systems that we're having right now in Utah, we had a lot of lambs dropping. So if you know the barometric pressure is about to drop, you can expect right before and after storms that you're going to have um, more lambs or kids drop during those times. Okay. Now, once we get them out, one thing I like to say, and this is pretty easy to remember, is clip, dip, and strip. So, clip would be to clip the umbilical cord so that it's just a couple inches, 2 to 3 inches, and not dragging on the ground. Dip, dip it in an iodine solution with a roughly 7% tincture, and you can go and buy this. Okay. This helps decrease any kind of umbilical infection that they may have. And then some other things that we may want to have on hand during our lambing season. So we need to make sure we have it at least a week before our scheduled lambing season based on this. And I would even argue 2 weeks before. Okay. We'd want the iodine ready. We'd want towels, disposable gloves, OB, lube. So if we had to palpate or help with lambing, we'd want to make sure we had lube and gloves. Um, Maybe a stomach tube and syringe, and I'll talk about that in a second. Lamb colostrum and milk replacer, we'll talk about that more too. Rectal thermometer, and then bands if we're going to be using bands to castrate or dock tails. Okay, so our goat producers wouldn't be docking tails this way. Okay, now the biggest two killers of lambing, far and away, is hypothermia and hypoglycemia. So they're either starving to death or they're freezing to death. Okay, so those are our two biggest killers in the first 24 to 48 hours. Out into the first 30 days is still high risk, but usually around things like pneumonia or other complications. But those first 24 to 48 hours, these are our two biggest issues. So body temperature shouldn't be below 99 degrees. So we'd have that rectal thermometer and we would check. Another quick way to check if the lamb is too cold, especially after lambing, is to stick your finger in their mouth, and usually you can feel that it's cold to the touch, or if they have no suckling reflex. Usually they'll not try to suck much if they're too cold. So there are things that you can do. You can build a hot box. This is like a simple made box with a screen, and you can put like a air dryer that you get from Walmart, and that allows air to move around the lamb and warm them up. Here's an example of it. Maybe it's a little bit fancier of a situation. And then if we're trying to battle something like hypoglycemia, there are things like NutriDrench that I think work really well. Okay. Now, colostrum. This is the vital part. We already vaccinated our ewes for this specific reason. Okay. We call this mother's first milk. It has antibodies. It's passive immunity for that lamb and essential to good, vital lambs and kids. It gives energy, vitamins. It's essentially a cocktail of vitamins and minerals and antibodies. Okay. Now, we only have so much time to make sure that they get colostrum in them. This top image is a really good example of this. Essentially, they're able to absorb more antibodies early on. If we go past 12 hours and then past 24 hours, and that lamb or kid has never gotten colostrum, you're going to have a really hard time getting any kind of passive immunity to them. I know some people that will tube their lambs no matter what, just to make sure that they get colostrum. I would say that isn't necessary generally, but as long as you make sure that ewe or doe is producing colostrum in milk, and that's where the strip part comes with the clip, dip, and strip. You strip the teat, you get out the little keratin plug, and you make sure they have colostrum and milk for their lambs. Okay. So we're really shooting for, I would say, the first 4 to 6 hours is when I like to make sure colostrum is in them. Okay. But definitely by 12 hours. Lambs and kids should get approximately 5% of their body weight. And so you can go ahead and calculate that. An example would be a 10-pound lamb. should receive roughly 8 ounces of colostrum. Okay. Now, if you have a ewe that lost her lambs but has colostrum, you can collect that colostrum and save it in Ziploc bags, or you can put it in ice cube containers, freeze this, and then put it in Ziploc bags. And this, I say that you can generally keep it for up to a year and use it potentially the next lambing season, but I probably wouldn't keep it much longer than that. There are also colostrum supplements that you can buy. A lot of them are bovine based, but something is still much better than nothing. Okay. Now, heaven forbid we have to go ahead and tube our lambs to ensure that they get colostrum. This is a pretty good indicator of how long that tube should be. So if you run the end of the tube to the last rib out the mouth, that gives you an idea of how much of that tube should feed in. One thing, this makes a lot of people nervous, and I would say that if you're really nervous about it, go ahead and call your veterinarian to help you, or if you have a mentor who's done this before. But as we feed this tube in, if you kind of cant it to the left side of the mouth and go down slowly and let that lamb kind of swallow it as you go, that's usually a pretty easy way to get into the rumen. And then you could also kind of smell. Usually they don't fight a lot if you're actually in the rumen, but if you get down the wrong tube into the lungs, um, the potential worst case scenario is that you put colostrum or tube them into the lungs, which could kill a lamb. But um, usually, if they're not fighting a lot, and if you feel like you can smell the rumen through the tube, it's usually a pretty good indicator that you're in there. Now, if we don't have veterinarians close by, and I would say have a really good uh, relationship with your veterinarian. Um, we talked how important it is to get colostrum into your lambs for their health. That's kind of where it's up to you guys. Well, do I learn how to tube my lamb or kid? And millions of people have done this over time, hundreds of thousands currently in the United States. Or, edge on them not getting colostrum in a sufficient amount of time, and then they may be poor doers. Okay. There are lots of videos on this. I'd encourage you to maybe look up YouTube videos. And if you want to know you're getting good ones, usually type extension around it. And then it's fairly science based. Okay. Milk replacers. So say that you didn't take your lamb or that doe didn't take her kid. There's a lot of ways to orphan and raise these lambs and kids. Now, milk replacer, we try not to do this. Because milk replacer is really expensive, but not all milk replacers are created equally. Now, I made these two tables, and one is of lamb milk replacer and one is of kid milk replacer. If you look across, and these are all really popular milk replacers that you guys probably see across the whole country, what I see between these two is that they're pretty similar, except for the crude fat content with sheep is generally at least 5 to 10% higher, meaning that young lambs generally require a higher energy content in their milk replacer than goats do. So I would say try to stay species specific as if you can. Okay. Um, there's a lot of ways to do this. You could do it on a bottle. Jokingly, growing up, we always said kid goats grow better when they're fed with Mountain Dew bottles. Okay, with our milk replacer. Um, you could also do this based on a bucket, and then this forces that lamb to kind of develop, or these kid goats in this case, to develop that sucking reflex to suck the milk up instead of it just being gravity fed into them, and that can be good for them. Here's another kind of trough scenario. And then there are also automated milking machines. Usually, those of us with small backyard flocks tend not to invest in a piece of equipment that expensive. But if you do have a larger operation, lactocyte machines or those automated milking machines are really good. Now,
Dad,
mothering crates can, yeah,
Dad, just a quick time check. It's
okay,
9:37. So
awesome.
thanks.
Um, So mothering crates can be really good to help these lambs mother up. And then kind of going from there, I do want to keep a couple minutes for questions. Going from there, identification is really important those first 30 days. So having ID tags, if we have a small farm flock, we may just remember whose offspring is with who. If you have a lot of sheep or goats that look the same, that may be very difficult. And so oftentimes we will paint brand our lambs and kids, and this paint brand will at least last us our first 30 days. So we can ensure that that mother has both of her twins and easily find them. So if one gets stuck in a feeder or if one is hiding somewhere, we can easily find it and associate it with the right ewe or doe. And so I've seen this done both with lambs and kids. It's pretty easy and to do, and I highly recommend it. Lastly, if you need to graft, and this is where we're trying to reduce the amount of milk replacer that we utilize, I would say grafting is really valuable. It's a little bit of an art. There's a lot of ways to do it, but ultimately, in those first early hours of lambing or kidding, that ewe and doe is extremely attracted to the scent of that amniotic fluid, and it helps her bond to her kid and to her lamb. And so, in these cases, I'm a big component of slime grafting, which is essentially taking the amniotic fluid in this case from this looks like a Jacob sheep or something like that, and taking that amniotic fluid and rubbing it on another lamb and then exposing it to her as if it was her own early on. Okay. You can also put them in a restraint, a head catch, and then kind of help foster that relationship through the head catch. And if one of their lambs was to die that they were bonded to, you could do a skin graft. This isn't as commonly done, but usually the most success I have is early on. But I know a lot of people that do really well with skin grafts. But unfortunately, that means that a lamb or kid has died, and we really want to avoid that if we can. And lastly, I hope we just love the heck out of what we're doing. Even though things may seem scary and there's a lot of work to do, we do this because we love the lifestyle, we love the animal, and hopefully we enjoy what we're doing. And then with that, I'm happy to take any questions for just a couple minutes and until our moderators say time is up.
So, Chad, I'm going to have you go ahead and stop sharing your screen so that our next
Okay.
presenter can get set up. But please stay on. So one of the questions that we had in the Q&A was, what interaction, if any, do your herding dogs have with pregnant ewes just previous to or immediately post lambing? When do you take the dogs off the pregnant or lambing ewes? How old are the lambs when you introduce working dogs?
So I know that some people leave the dogs in during lambing and kidding. And if you have a dog that's well bonded, that is okay to do. If it makes you nervous, go ahead and remove them. But if we think about predation and the purpose of the dog, most predation acts generally occurs around lambing and kidding. So if we're pasture lambing or kidding, that dog is kind of vital to the survival of our lambs and kids. And now you may get a dog eating placenta or licking off lambs. And if you see that dog is scaring your does or your ewes away from the lamb, you may need to intervene and remove him. But if he's there and he's protecting from maybe eagles or caracara birds, which are very invasive across the US now, or coyotes or something else, he plays a pretty vital role during that time. And so I would say if you don't have to remove him, don't do it. But if you feel like he's intervening with good mothering, then go ahead and remove him. So,
Great, thank you. And then the second question, or the last question that we have right now, is how soon can lambs or kids, I'm going to add kids in there, be weaned?
now, that's a great question. I just did a webinar last week and we had some producers that do accelerated lambing and they wean at 42 days, which blows me away. Now, in the Western US, I would say an average weaning is 90 days, which is 3 months. A little bit sooner weaning is 60 days. But I think it's important to point out that the rumen of the lamb doesn't really develop until around 30 to 35 days. And so the earliest I can wean lambs that are on milk replacer is 35 days in my barn. Now, around day 40 is when that ewe and doe is hitting peak milk production. So if you can keep them on the ewe and doe for 60 to 90 days, you're going to have exceptionally better growth and than you would if you tried to wean them early. But if you're trying to do an accelerated system and lamb again soon, you need to breed up to lamb accelerated instead of just one lamb or kid crop a year. Then you need to pull them off and then put condition back on your ewe. And so it goes back to that first slide. What are our objectives of our operation? How do we want to manage it? But I would say if you want to take full potential of that mother raising that lamb or kid, the longer they can stay on, the better to an extent. Yeah.
Wonderful. I don't see any additional questions in the chat right now. There are a lot of thank yous and in the
Okay.
main messaging for you, Chad. We really appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing your time and knowledge with us. As a reminder to the group, the webinar poll has ended, so thanks for filling out the poll as well. Yeah, and
Yeah.
wonderful information. Chad, one thing that I would recommend if you can do for us is to put the link to your monthly webinar into the chat. I know you mentioned
Sure.
it, but I don't know if people can get more, where they can get more information. I personally watch those webinars as often as I can, and they're fantastic. So I would encourage anyone that's on the call to jump on this.